Here we go. So, oh, I heard my cat make a cute noise. She's sleeping back there. So we did the introduction, right? Is that what we did today? The whole damn thing, which I thought was pretty interesting. I'm probably given I haven't actually started reading the text yet, but given the reputation Schelling has for being difficult, probably having the introduction is probably going to be helpful, giving it a context. I don't really have sort of an opening question. I guess it would be nice if, and I was trying to go back over this. I should have started earlier. I was just trying to skim back over the introduction and kind of look at what I had highlighted and a few notes I had written. But it'd be nice to just, I think that his point in the introduction is to place Schelling in the context of theodicy, the problem of freedom, and the problem of evil in the philosophical tradition. And it would just be nice to have a good general sense of that when we're done. That would be my hope. And I was looking back through here about what he says about Leibniz and the traditional way that philosophers have done theodicy, and then the way that Kant screwed up theodicy and shifted the problem of evil, and then the way Schelling responds to that. So that seems to be the kind of general sequence. And, you know, one thing I have not read a lot about this, but I noticed, I was surprised, if I understand this right, I could completely be wrong, when he starts talking about Leibniz at the very beginning, and he starts talking about evil is nothing but this pure privation of being. I don't know who first came up with that idea. It's probably very old, but I know Augustine, that's the way he defined evil. And
I think Plotinus came up with that.
Oh, is that Plotinus?
And he doesn't mention that at all, which is strange, but I know Plotinus had that idea.
He doesn't mention
maybe someone else came up with that before him, but
and he doesn't mention the Christian tradition prior to Leibniz, which that was a dominant way of dealing with evil, because you don't want to have your God being the author of evil. That wouldn't be a good thing. And so the privation was a way of getting God out of having been the author of evil. And I don't, I thought it was just interesting that there seems to be a bit of a shift with Leibniz, that it's not quite that he's not exactly trying to deal with that problem exactly, of trying to get God out of trouble. But anyway, I just like to get a broad sense of what the movement is here from Leibniz through up to Schelling. That's just stating a goal.
Yeah, it seems like for Leibniz, he kind of, God, I guess, kind of takes the place of, this God of the gaps that can basically connect all these different monads and whatnot, and in a way somehow preserves their freedom while also ordering things according to a teleology. So I'm not exactly sure how he combines those, but I think it's interesting that he's saying basically, once again, it's the whole thing of, well, evil doesn't really exist. It's a privation the same way, there's the metaphor of light and darkness, Does a shadow really exist? No, it's just the privation of light. Does cold really exist? No, it's just the privation of heat, And I think there's something like, those chain emails you get from your grandma about, Obama being like a terrorist or something. I think there's also one that was really popular about this idea of God being
Uh-oh. Oops.
okay, I can hear you guys. Okay, I think I'm back. Okay. So anyways, what I was saying is it's really still a very popular idea in even mainstream Christianity, this idea of evil as privation. And I think it's interesting in the sense that it seems difficult for people to really accept the notion of evil as a positive reality.
So I think a couple things that are interesting about that to me, because it does seem like maybe the specific formulation of it as a problem in need of a theodicy goes back to Plotinus, but it does seem to me that you can extract the same concept from both Aristotle and Plato, right? Insofar as they want to say something like Aristotle would want to say that what evilness is or what badness is, however we want to define that, or specifically talk about that, is being insufficiently virtuous, right? So it's sort of something going wrong in an otherwise teleologically directed entity. And it seems to me that Plato wants to say something similar insofar as like evil is when things deviate too much from the forms that they're supposed to reflect or represent too much of a jumbling together of various forms or something like that. So I think that this, one thing that I think someone might like Deleuze might say is that this is like a characteristic of all fundamentally ordered thinking, right? In the way that that Plato or Aristotle might be a representative of. If you're going to say that ultimately the world should reflect some sort of rational, character and its ultimate being, then you're always going to view anything that deviates from that as being a kind of irrationality, which means you're going to accuse it of being incomplete, insufficient, right? Not something that has an existence of its own right, but is like a dark reflection of something that's more essential and better. The other thing that I was going to say, kind of from the other end, is it's interesting that I mean, this is the first thing of Schelling's that I'm ever going to seriously interact with, and it's interesting that it's a theodicy in that this question of the problem of evil is something that I'm used to engaging with purely from like modern analytic philosophy angle, right? In terms of like a discussion between an apologist and I don't know, a new atheist about what the like some specific logically derived version of the problem of evil. So they're going to be like, okay, well, we're interested in the problem of natural evil or something like that, and then you'll get like 2 or 3 premises and a conclusion, and then you just have debate about whether or not that those 2 or 3 premises and a conclusion are correct or incorrect. Is there a flaw? Is it a bad argument? Is it fallacious? Something like that. And it's a little bit weird to me, particularly in terms of this discussion of Kant. Like, it makes sense to me in the abstract to say like the problem of that is being considered in theodicies has traditionally been a metaphysical one, but I'm so used to this problem coming down to a question of human free will. Like the traditional response from a apologist in the modern like analytic context is going to be literally like, oh, well, evil exists because human beings have free will, and human beings have to have free will because that's an important aspect of God's creation. Like it's such a common response that like in the field they had to invent this other term, right? The problem of natural evil, to talk about other forms of evil that don't have to do with free will, because people are just like, let's just shelve this and let's talk about something else, because like that aspect of the problem seems reasonably satisfied. Yeah.
So what, the way I think about like the Greeks and Kant, actually similar in some way, like, in this article, he says that Kant, I guess the reason the writer says that Kant eliminated theodicy is because he did shift it to a problem of free will rather than having any sort of concern about, the metaphysical nature of evil and whether God had anything to do with it. And so, the way he characterizes Kant is, if you allow yourself to be controlled by your inclinations, that's evil. Whereas rather, if you were doing your duty, you were acting on pure practical reason through the goodwill, and that's good. And I see a similar thing in the Greeks in that they don't. One time I was talking about the will in classical Greek philosophy, and this professor was like, where do you ever see anyone talk about the will? And so it's kind of interesting that you never actually see that, but you do have like an Aristotle's thing about rational wish. You wish for something to happen. But, for the way I see Aristotle and Plato, you have the animal appetites and the spirited feelings. And the purpose of virtue is to moderate the appetites and the spirit using reason, because it's reason that knows what the appropriate degree of it, what the mean is in each case. And so it seems to me similar in that you have this rational principle and these non-rational motives in both Kant and the Greeks. The difference seems to be that for the Greeks, you moderate those, and they're still legitimate motives. It's okay to be motivated by your appetites and your spirited feelings as long as they're rationally moderated. Whereas for Kant, it seems like he wants you to not be motivated by them at all. But in both cases, there's this tension between the rational principle and these non-rational motives that are primarily grounded in the body and affects and feelings and that kind of stuff. Whereas, for theodicy, like when I think about Augustine seems to think that it's similar in that you have a rational will, but that the rational will is either tends toward God or toward the corporeal domain. And when it tends toward the corporeal domain is when you allow your rational will to be actually controlled by your appetites and so on. Whereas when it's attracted toward God, then your will is motivated by love for God rather than attraction to the appetites. And so then he puts God in there, but he has to define evil as a privation, he has to define it metaphysically as a privation, because since God created everything, if there was metaphysical evil, then God would have created metaphysical evil, and you can't have that. So metaphysical evil has to be the absence of good, because otherwise you would have a good God creating metaphysical evil. And so he has these illustrations, like when you have a wound, that wound is a privation of health. And when you heal, you didn't, it's not like you scooped the evil out of your arm and threw it into the trash can. It's just that the wound is an absence of health. And then when health returns, the good returns, but there was a privation of health. And so that's why Augustine, for example, defines it that way. And then in regard to the moral evil, since the will is free, the will is kind of hovering between attraction to God and attraction to the created order. But God is obviously good, but the created order is not evil, because then again, that would make God the creator of evil. It's just that the created order is less perfect than God. And so when you know, moral evil is when you allow your will to love that which is less than God. But that which is less than God is not evil. It's just not, it's just less than. Again, it's sort of an ontological lack. It's, you know, it's kind of this Platonic notion of the corporeal domain is less real than the divine domain. And so your will is being attracted to that which is less real than God. And so on both of those, you know, Augustine's motive for defining evil as a lack is to get God out of having created evil and making our choice of doing evil, again, is not an attraction to a metaphysically positive evil. It's an attraction towards something that is less than, you know, as a privation of perfection. So that's why I say, you know, when he starts talking about Leibniz, at least, I mean, I don't know almost nothing about Leibniz, but he's, at least the author here doesn't really bring God into it. It's more about whether or not evil can serve the purposes of the good ultimately or not. I assume that Augustine would say it can also. I don't know that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much like the standard answer for a lot of those things, is that the part that seems to our fallible, finite minds to be something bad, that in the whole, as judged by a perfect mind, the mind of God, it would be good in terms of the whole. But so I think what both of you were saying about, you know, privation and evil, whatnot. So Bergson does a really good job of explaining, you know, how this idea of, you know, the Platonic Aristotelian emanationist idea of, you know, degrees of reality, how that all starts with this idea of, you know, there's this first principle that is this perfect eternal principle of absolute reality. And from there, it's, well, okay, how do we get any kind of differentiation or movement? How do we explain time and multiplicity and all these things? Well, it can only be through some kind of lack or imperfection of this total positive fullness of reality, you know. So then you have this idea of degrees, and you can see that definitely. I really think starting with Plato, although some of the pre-Socratics, you could probably point that out there, because Bergson makes the case that it's part of how the intellect just naturally functions to think like this. And you definitely see it with Leibniz in that he's very much taking this kind of, especially a Neoplatonic idea of all these things. But then so the Neoplatonic ideas through St. Augustine became part of the Christian tradition. And that's where you get this idea of the privation. So I think what Schelling does, that the authors indicate in this introduction that's kind of revolutionary, I guess, is that he's really trying to come to terms with evil as a positive reality, as something that actually exists, that's not just, you know, a lack or a negation of something. Because those other ways of doing it, well, like he was talking about with Hegel, in that sense, Hegel seems to more not take on the challenge of evil as something existing as truly evil in and of itself, but it's something that can be just kind of put in with the whole of reality, and then therefore, in a sense, really actually negates its evil as something that's evil. It becomes something that's in the service of the good. I forget the term he uses, but it's like recompensation or
reconciliation. It's like a help.
Yes, thank you. I can't think properly, but
maybe before we jump into Schelling, maybe a question I had, just because I found it really interesting, when he was in that section where they're talking about Hegel's culmination. So maybe like the page after XIII and XIV. It's at the bottom of XIII. He says there's 2 points here, 2 central points. And he says the presentation of God is like a philosopher's God. And he talks about this God being kind of like a pure rationality or systematic rationality. And then they're kind of like using this attempt to demonstrate the rationality of the world as a bulwark support of modern science's drive to impose human authority over nature. So to me, I was just, wondering, how does the negative, or does the negative concept of evil like directly tie to that, somehow justifying this kind of like conquest we're after with nature?
Joey,
how does the notion of evil being negative tie into that?
Joey, I remember finding that really interesting too. But would you tell me again exactly where that's at? So, are you using that the one that has the blue?
I have a printed out PDF.
Oh, you've got a print
from a copy that Chase had sent us. My pages for this when he first mentions it are page XIV.
Okay. Thank you.
And then I think he goes on about it.
Okay, thank you.
At some point.
Yeah, so he's saying basically that that first principle, that the principle of absolute rationality, pure rationality, as the first cause of all these things, and that is what usually takes the place of God in a lot of these cases. And of course, he talks also about how the principle of sufficient reason works in the sense that, okay, existence has to ultimately be reducible to some kind of a reason. It has to be rationally calculable. And the notion of evil in that regard as negativity would be those things that don't make sense and that they can't be termed in, they can't be put into terms of systematic rationality. Those are the things that we can just consider non-existent, in the same way that a hardcore materialist scientist or somebody would say today that, all the things that we can't measure with scientific instruments or whatnot, that's what's not real. That's what doesn't fit into our pure rationality, our set of categories and whatnot.
That kind of hit a click for me. And then another question I have, and maybe definitely he hasn't brought it up or anything, but I keep seeing this like referenced here and there and like other descriptions of Schelling. But his idea, he's against like system, the notion of system. I don't know is that kind of equated to systematic rationality, and just the kind of system builders of German idealism is kind of what I think about. Would that be tied with pretty much what they're talking about with like their notion of God, the philosopher's notion of God?
Yeah, I think so. That's what Heidegger says. And that he kind of outlines the notion of system in German idealism, and says basically that's kind of like almost like the bigger sort of template that this whole principle of sufficient reason, rationality thing is just one of the characteristics of, which is, it's basically the same thing of saying that, things are capable of being fit into this system that is completely open and transparent to reason itself, and especially a kind of mathematical way of framing reason and in framing things, that basically it creates like this mold that you fit things in, or they simply don't fit in and you throw them out. At least I think that's what probably Heidegger, and I guess probably Schelling as well, would say. And that's the problem with systems, in the sense of trying to get some kind of a completeness to them by just this principle of, some kind of, the typical German idealist system, I guess. Ultimately, I think the thing is that there's some kind of a equivocation of what is rationally understandable with being itself. And I think Schelling and Heidegger both reject that, in the sense that, yeah, that's going to reveal some things about existence, but it's also going to leave as many things out. Basically, your criteria is much a way of including or talking about things as it is a way of excluding all these other things. And what about that remainder that still is there, that we can't rationally put into clear and distinct categories and mathematical calculations and all that?
I wanted to read a passage at the top of page 20, Roman numeral 20, XX, related to Joey's question, at least in that edition that I've got. So right up at in the first full sentence, he said, here is one of the central points of Schelling's approach, that evil introduces a necessary imbalance into the system of the world, that this imbalance is itself the origin and life of the system, the impulsion to the self-revelation of the absolute or of God. Yet evil is not on that account a good systematic citizen. It is essentially chaotic or anarchic, and as such always threatens to turn the system to its own ends, to make a system its servant. Precisely this terrible tension is the essential medium of life, of the organic struggle of forces that constitute the true basis of the whole. Vitality becomes the highest value, of vitality that exists only because of the ceaseless struggle of forces. And so, I don't know, I have not read Schelling before, but this sounds, and maybe this is just preliminary, that Schelling's not rejecting the idea of systems so much as he's incorporating a principle within the system that imbalances the system, or that, as it says here, this imbalance, this sort of anarchic and chaotic principle that's not a good systemic citizen. Because he's pointed out that in Hegel and in some of these Leibniz, that evil is actually a good systemic citizen, in that it ultimately, well, like Leibniz, this is the best of all possible worlds. And so even though there's this evil in the sense of privation, ultimately that evil comes to be part of the good, or comes to somehow enhance or promote the good. And I get the impression, maybe Hunter knows better than I, but he seems to be saying that Hegel's notion of evil is similar, that within the dialectic, it's incorporated into the system in such that what we would perceive as evil is a good systemic citizen. Whereas here, Schelling includes a principle and it sounds like it's within the system, but it's something that subverts the system from within. And that seems to be, what seems to be radically different here is that that this notion of evil does have a positive character, and that it's also very subversive, where for these other, where you want everything to, like Chase was saying, where you desperately need everything to be rationally intelligible, anything that is not rationally intelligible, you either eject or you define as nothing, not actually existing. You somehow eliminate that subversive element, whereas here Schelling actually incorporates it into the system.
One thing that I've heard about Schelling, or I guess maybe more like an impression that I have about him as a thinker, is that he's sort of like a missing link between Kant and Nietzsche. And I think in particular, like this conception, I mean, what I always, like what my brain wants to go to is the, I don't know how to describe it, the analogy, the parable that that Nietzsche gives of the man who's like a ball of snakes, right? Do y'all know about that one? Where it's like this, basically, like, you know, Nietzsche conceives of human being as like this vast array of impulses that are pushing and pulling us in a bunch of different directions. And that can be beneficial, like that can turn out well, but he has this analogy of the man who's like a ball of snakes, the pale criminal, thank you, who, like, all of those impulses just come together in a way that makes him like totally destructive to everything around him, and makes it so that society has to toss him out, right, or has to do awful things to him because because he is fundamentally destructive in the structure that he has. And so I think that Schelling's conception of evil plays into that in an interesting way, where it's like, okay, well, sometimes evil plays a role that leads to the, at least based on what we've read so far in the introduction, evil leads to like a kind of beneficial growth or a beneficial vitality of the system. But that doesn't mean that evil is interested in that goal and is aimed at it, right? Which is what would have to be true if it was a good systemic citizen, right? In the way that these prior theodicies kind of conceived of it. It has its own agenda and its own goal that is destructive to that system, but the system has ways of reincorporating it back into proper functioning, which is like, seems to me very proto-Nietzschean in the way that you would think about things.
It seemed that way to me too.
So that reminds me, I don't know a lot about him, but Bataille, he talks a lot about this notion of kind of like an excess of energy. And I believe he ties that in with some kind of a metaphysical concept of evil. So he talks about, that he's basically arguing against the idea that there's that economy is always something that's rationally calculable, that's, you have some kind of even give and take in terms of an economy and whatnot, saying basically that there's an excess of energy that just simply seeks to expend itself, and it doesn't care about what it gets in return. And I think he thinks that evil, as well as a bunch of other things, life, I guess maybe itself, would also go along with that, with this kind of just excess of vitality and energy and whatnot. But yeah, that's possibly an interesting connection. That's also, so I got this one book called The New Schelling that has a bunch of, secondary source articles. And one of them was comparing Nietzsche to Schelling's idea of the will, and basically showing how it's much more similar to Nietzsche's idea than Schopenhauer's. So I didn't read all of it, but it's pretty interesting, and they have pretty similar ideas about the concept of will going on.
One question I've been interested in for a while is, when Nietzsche says that the classic civilizations like the Romans, the Greeks, were interested in the difference between good and bad, but then when you get Christians, you get good and evil. And so wondering what the difference between bad and evil was and I have a sort of an incomplete sense, but maybe this can help, or this reading can help. So, my sense with like with the Greeks again, or well, I should say with Aristotle, my incomplete bad understanding of Aristotle, but it sounds like stuff I've heard Plato say too. But anyway, like I was saying before, you've got these appetitive and spirited feelings that need to be rationalized. They need to be moderated. And when someone does something bad, it's because some appetite or desire or drive or whatever has gotten out of hand, or it could be the other way. Like if you have insufficient courage, then it's too weak rather than too strong. And so there isn't an evil as such. There's just sort of this imbalance in the soul where the non-rational motives, which you have to have, because if you don't have them, you'll die, but they get out of hand where they get too strong or too weak. Whereas, and so that's my thinking, the way I've tried to understand what Nietzsche means when he says good versus bad. Although he also connects it with, the contemptible masses, which may be the people who just can't regulate themselves rationally or something. But then you've got this evil thing in the Christianity. I mean, and having grown up in fundamentalist Christianity, I have kind of a intuitive grasp of how evil is different, but it's hard for me to articulate exactly one way I've thought about it is that, if you think someone's evil, you think that they really deserve to be tortured for eternity. Like the way the Greeks, at least the way Nietzsche portrays them, the Greek nobility, they didn't think that the contemptible masses deserved eternal torture. They just thought they were contemptible. They were just kind of like beneath my consideration. They were just bad. They weren't evil. Whereas, the priests want the powerful to suffer. They really, really want them to suffer. And so what is it? And so now I'm trying to figure out how this fits in here. Like when he says, so evil is privation, doesn't sound like something worth being tortured for eternity. But then if you get like Kant saying, well, evil is when you choose willingly to indulge your egoistic inclinations rather than follow your duty and the goodwill. I don't know, that still doesn't sound that evil to me. I'm having a hard time figuring out exactly what is evil as opposed to just bad.
Yeah, so what I remember from the genealogy of morality is that Nietzsche was basically saying, with the Greeks and basically, or pre-Christian or pre-Judeo-Christian, I guess, the idea of bad was kind of like synonymous with misfortunate. Like, I'm in a misfortunate position, this is bad. And like, oh, I don't want to be that less powerful person. That's bad. That's unfortunate. But it was almost like, those people weren't taken as some kind of metaphysically evil thing, where I think he's saying that with Christianity, you get a metaphysical evil. And, I think that's different from the way that they talk about metaphysical evil in this introduction so I think here there's a big difference, maybe not a big difference, but a difference between what you'd call a kind of like a philosophical theology of evil, which is all about this privation idea, and then like the folk concept of evil, which is basically like a personification of, this is essentially Satan. And this idea of evil absolutely is a positive reality. It's a force in the world acting constantly against these things. And, you see that today with, a lot of people that, believe very much in that the devil is a real being, acting very, very much actively going against things in the world and doing things, and even manipulating scientific experiments and everything, almost like an evil genius, something with the extreme power in the world. And that's so different from this privation idea. Well, they're essentially the opposite, but I think what Nietzsche was basically saying was that Christianity first gave this this turn from, you know, the misfortunateness of bad, or somebody who's just like disagreeable because they're, you know, what they want is counter to what I want, into something that's an absolute, and that's a metaphysical absolute, like the idea of Satan. And I think that's where he would say that that's the idea of evil as distinct from bad, I think.
So then if you say evil is a privation, that kind of undercuts that. I mean, I think, you know, like the theologians like Augustine, they did that, and, you know, I don't know, maybe the Neo-Platonists, but he did that for theological reasons, to get God out of trouble. But, you know, it sounds like evil as a privation really weakens that notion of metaphysical evil. And then again, you know, to say, for, you know, if he's right that for Kant, evil is just not doing your duty or doing contrary to duty, that's like he explicitly says, or in the introduction, you know, that Kant also sort of eliminated metaphysical evil by converting it from by taking it out of metaphysics and putting it into ethics and just being a matter of choosing. But it sounds like, so am I right in thinking that from what I've seen here, that Schelling is actually trying to return a metaphysically positive character to evil? Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also the point that they're trying to make is that this is what is so dangerous to any kind of a system, because, you know, I think the system, it relies on these notions of, you know, ultimately like this positive, total rational principle, and evil is what cannot fit into that, because then evil would have to be something that's, you know, rationally willed by this one force of good, and those just can't fit together. And I think that's why you have this kind of tension between the whole tradition of, you know, from I guess really from Platonism, I guess, at least from the basically like the Christian medieval philosophers, and especially with Descartes, you see this, and all the rationalists, to this idea of not being able to really fit this principle in the system of some kind of a positive evil, which, if you think about it, you know, just intuitively think of something that's like really evil. It's something that can't be rationally comprehended, can't be really fit into something. It's so outside of our notions of understanding of rationality that it just cuts through all those things and yet is there. You know, it's like the way that they talk about terrorism. Well, so Baudrillard, he talks about terrorism, that basically what we don't understand about it is that it gives a positive signification for death, which in our culture we don't have. Death is something that's completely excluded from any kind of positive signification. And that's why we see it as evil, because we have no way of actually understanding it or comprehending it. It's outside of our symbol system. And I think that's kind of the thing about the notion of evil, is it's something that's always going to be outside of a symbol system or a rational system of philosophy or whatever it is. And that's what's kind of I guess it's kind of the central tension also that they're pointing out with this in the introduction, is that Schelling is trying to come up with some kind of a philosophy that is trying to include something that is kind of outside of reason, or at least systematic reason. So yeah, I think Sean wanted to say something, but then he left. Oh well.
I feel like I'm like still trying to get that click about what is the relevance of the move from like metaphysical evil to moral evil for Kant? Like, what does that avoid for him? And then why is there the pull for Schelling to like reestablish it back in its metaphysical realm?
I think I could say why. Well, are you asking why would Kant take it out of the metaphysical realm, and why would Schelling want to put it back in?
Yes, yeah. What about like Kant's project? And I feel like this is at the beginning of the Kantian intervention. I see him talking about that, but it maybe hasn't fully clicked for me. Why is it relevant? Yeah, so why does Kant want to pull it in and just totally dismiss the idea of a medical physical evil? And then why do we want to why does Schelling want to reestablish it back as metaphysical?
Yeah, I think I could explain how Kant's notion of evil is moral and not metaphysical, but I guess I have the same question.
Yeah, and I guess at the
What's the motive
bottom
for that, and what's the motive for putting it back?
I'm looking at the bottom of 15 and like top of 16. And this is when he gets into saying like Kant moves it over to morality. He pretty much dismisses it about a question about God. He like dismisses that idea. He's like, no, it's about humans, and something you said earlier, Reese, it's about humans just making a choice between this or that, between, you know, rationality or their own ends. And, you know, he says this is an exceeding bold move. It's entirely consistent with Kant's project of autonomy. But then he mentioned something about ambiguities. I guess, what does that do for Kant, and why is that a problem for Schelling's project? Is kind of the question.
So,
And then I say, and I don't remember how this ties into Schelling, but I remember, maybe it's later in the article, but talking about how Schelling took and ran with Kant's idea of radical evil. And yes, so what notion of evil does Kant offer that Schelling likes, but puts, is it metaphysical? Is Kant's radical evil at all related to the metaphysical, or is that Schelling takes that idea while it's still moral for Kant and kind of like throws it into the metaphysical? And then again, what really does that mean?
I'm looking at the sort of the top of page 16, XVI, the first full paragraph. Kant's thinking about radical evil introduces evil as a propensity in human beings that is basic and ineradicable. In doing so, Kant seems to confer on evil a status that had hitherto been denied, that is, the status of positivity. No longer is evil simply that which is not. Now, indeed, evil can be a positive guide for action. And so I think, you know, based on what that paragraph, another thing, I think that he's saying that it's still purely moral. It's not metaphysical for Kant, because it's still a matter of choice. It's a matter of the will rather than something like the structure of reality. You know, it's not about the nature of being or existence. It's a matter of how we choose. But it looks like what was radical here is that evil can be a positive guide for action. Whereas I guess he's saying, and I haven't thought about why this is true for the previous people he's talked about, evil is not really a positive guide for action, but for Kant it can be. That seems to be what he's saying that Schelling picked up on, but then I guess Schelling went further and made it a metaphysical principle as well.
So I am seeing evil as a propensity in human beings that is basic. That's again on 16. He says radical, reaching to the root, in any radicable. Radical as in like it's just like. And so I'm reading this other article too by Worth, the guy who translated, I think, our copy of Ages of the World that we're going to get. And he's talking about Kant's subtle distinction between propensity and predisposition, and propensity being like something along the lines of still allowing that freedom, whereas like predisposition being kind of like necessary, whereas like propensities are like contingencies. And I'm just kind of noting that because I feel like it's in here somewhere where they start to talk about the issues for Kant is that how do we have a propensity for it while also still being free? And yeah, I feel like at least the other article made it sound like the way Kant is using the word propensity is not necessarily like any kind of like necessary obligation to be evil, but still allows for that freedom.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like they're saying that there's a tension in Kant between the idea that, you know, his whole system of practical philosophy and whatnot is dependent on the autonomy of human freedom, but yet his notion of evil, which I think is necessary as a guide for how freedom should act according to the moral duty and whatnot, that is something that actually limits or possibly even contradicts that freedom that is necessary for morality to begin with. And Kant's answer to that is to say that it's not necessarily a straightforward causal, you know, efficient cause kind of thing, but it's more an inclination. But then it's kind of so they show in this article that there's basically different interpretations about, you know, one person calls it the Kantian Paradox and says basically it doesn't work. And the big thing I think though for Schelling is that this gets transferred over. And okay, so Kant took it out of metaphysics because of, you know, the whole antinomies of reason thing, that basically, you know, we can't, if it's outside of a possible experience, then we can't talk about it. And that would include all these things about God. You know, he goes through all the traditional arguments for the existence of God, you know, the ontological argument, all these things, and shows that they lead to these contradictions, and therefore pure reason can't know these things. So instead, you know, of course, this leaves room though for practical reason and morality and faith and all this sneaky Christian stuff that Kant likes to do. And that's where those notions of evil come in and whatnot, but he's taking them specifically out of that metaphysical terrain and putting them in the terrain of practical reason of, you know, well, which is basically about human action and whatnot. And Schelling is taking those principles that Kant came up with for practical reason and saying, no, let's insert them not only back into metaphysics, but into into God himself, you know, and saying basically like this relationship of, you know, the ground and existence, those are instead going to be these two forces of, you know, I guess like a freedom and then also like an inclination that could possibly disrupt the system altogether, or maybe not system isn't the right word, but whatever, the Godhead, the principle of creation, or whatever he's going to call it. Not really sure yet.
Good flow.
There's a paragraph on page 17, XVII, that where he summarizes Kant's notion of good and evil. This is the second full paragraph. A good choice is one that pursues rational ends. It is exercised for the sake of the moral law, for the sake of duty, and both duty and law are universal insofar as they are the products of reason in the form of a categorical imperative. An imperative is that by its very nature must be universal. An evil choice is one that is exercised for the sake of inclination, that is, inclination of a particular individual. And this inclination is personal, subjective, and deeply contingent, is thereby turned into a maximum of action that subordinates to its particularity the universality contained in the moral law and duty attached to it. For Kant, radical evil is precisely this chosen subordination of that which is universal to that which is particular, of the inherent universality of reason to the inherent particularity of personal inclination. This reversal of the relation between the universal and the particular is the perversion at the heart of Kant's concept of radical evil, and it represents a very powerful innovation in the tradition since it insists on the primacy of choice and the autonomy of the subject that can act positively in an evil manner. So I don't know if that answers our questions, but at least it's a fairly clear explanation of what he thinks Kant means by evil.
And maybe like now kind of throwing out a hypothesis / question, what are y'all thinking? But so Kant, just bringing it back into morality, basically leaves it to be like only a human problem, right? As opposed to, and I'm thinking like Schelling has got this like emphasis on nature, is returning it to the metaphysical, being like, well, nature and being also participates in this, what could be considered evil.
Yes. That's the way I understand it. Is Kant saying we can't really know those things according to reason, at least, but we can engage with them and believe in them and use them as guides for our moral action as humans. But yeah, that we can't know essentially what's going on with the larger metaphysical picture in terms of these principles. And that's what I think Schelling is doing. And yes, I think nature works in its system as a kind of, well, the way I can't remember, I watched some video, I think on YouTube, like Matthew Seagal or whatever his name is, describing Schelling's nature philosophy, but he described it in relation to Fichte that made a lot of sense to me. And that, okay, so Fichte is basically saying, the first principle of philosophy is the I, the ego, the self, the I am, but it's not a substance like Descartes thought. Descartes' a big dummy. And yeah, that's right, I said it. It's an activity, this thinking, the self-positing of the I, but the self-positing of the I has to come to some kind of determination of itself through almost like a kind of reflection against what is not itself. So then this is where the idea of the dialectic comes from. That's right, Hegel stole the dialectic from Fichte. Yeah, I just wanted to trigger Hunter there. But yeah, so the whole point though is what for Fichte is just kind of like an intersubjective space of otherness in which the self comes to know itself. That's what nature is for Schelling. Nature is kind of like this other that works in a dialectic with us in order to come to some kind of self-awareness, I think. I'm probably getting that somewhat wrong on a technical level, but that's my general understanding.
I have to take the bait. I know that I'm just taking bait right now, but I have to just respond to that really quickly because I mean, first principles. Technically, Fichte and a guy whose last name was Reinhold, another German idealist, they had the similar idea about a thing called a statement, or in German, I think the word is a Satz. I hope I'm coming in good. I hope I sound good. But there was this idea in Fichte. And I'm referencing Gadamer right now. I'm referencing just some Gadamer that I read, where he kind of explicates all this. That in Fichte there was a proposition. There's a proposition, or in German it's called a Grundsatz, and it's considered, at least for Fichte, the basic mode of philosophical presentation. These propositions. And these were the building blocks of thought. And it produced sort of lines of reasoning, that played themselves out, which could transcend the understanding, like what as Kant demonstrated. Kant was the one who kind of put forward this idea that reasoning can transcend the rigid determinations of the understanding. And Fichte and Reinhold and Hegel and Schelling were all very interested in that, I think. But Fichte and Reinhold had this proposition as the building block of theory or thought, and I think that Hegel opposed this approach with his dialectic. I think that for Hegel, the dialectical process of a thing unfolding, of a self-consciousness thinking itself in all possible determinations of thought, which I think that it's a philosophical demonstration, and it's nothing like a mathematical demonstration, at least as far as Hegel was concerned. Hegel very much put forward that there was this radical difference between mathematical demonstration and philosophical demonstration, in the sense that I think, and this is from my bit, like I'm a noob. I don't know anything about Hegel, but like this is my basic idea of what I like think he's trying to say, and it's that maybe his idea of infusing concepts of spirit, and that's recognizing the role of a knower knowing a thing, which we talk about in its existence. I also want to point to another thing. Speaking of which, because I think that Hegel is, first off, Hegel's very explicit that content will always exceed its form, in the sense that he says that if we infuse things with spirit, it's an act of dissolving the fixed determinations of thought for dialectical movement or whatever, which is just a fancy way, I guess, of saying that when you recognize your position in knowing a thing or in a thing being known, there's like this, and this is kind of like in response to what Chase was saying, and this is in response to Fichte. This is in response to Fichte. Hegel's like trying to say we don't have to give the concept an ego that's attached to it anymore, because we know about self-consciousness immanently as we know a concept. We know that it's a concept within self-consciousness, and so we don't need to attach an ego to it, and therefore the object appears as being, just as being, and can be talked about as being. But and here's two other things I wanted to touch on. He recognizes that, or he's very explicit about content exceeding form, and that includes a sort of dialectical system of trying to approach the absolute. In fact, I don't necessarily think that like an individual is going to reach the absolute, through his spirit or his mind, but that things
Not the only one he froze for, right?
No, he pissed off the philosophy gods. Oh, he's back.
my roommates are watching hockey. They're streaming it, and it's cutting me out. Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
watches hockey?
Hegel's natural enemy, hockey.
Listen,
I've just
my okay. So just so
Blame
in
it
case
on
that
the
happens again.
Canadians.
Yeah, in case that happens again, I want to just make a point about Hegel and evil, and then be done. I think that I want to quote his philosophy of nature when it comes to Hegel and his kind of theodicy. Hegel has kind of a theodicy. Well, first off, Hegel says that the history of human existence is a theodicy. And there are huge papers written about that I have not read and probably won't read for a very long time. And so I don't really know what he means by that. But I have another piece of, I have two other things to bring up about Hegel and evil. And that's a quote from Philosophy of Nature, section 247 of Philosophy of Nature. Hegel says, if God is all-sufficient and lacks nothing, why does he disclose himself in a sheer other of himself? The divine idea is exactly this: to disclose itself, to posit this other outside of itself, and to take it back again into itself in order to be subjectivity and spirit. The idea determines itself, posits difference within itself, and other, but in such a way that its indivisible nature, it is infinite goodness, imparting to its otherness and sharing with it its entire fullness of content, which is insane. That's an insane way to say that. And it's like, but I think basically what he's trying to say is that there's a positive otherness within a notion, including in the idea of the absolute God and any universal. There's an excess, and that excess is reconciled or recognized in some way, given recognition, and posited and kind of reintegrated and in a way sublimated and brought into like a notional form where it's all transcended, which I don't really understand yet. But another thing, that's my last thing, is that he has a notion called the absolute recoil. Hegel has a notion called the absolute recoil. And it's the idea that the loss of something, and this is what the privation, this is like Hegel on privation. Think about like the metaphysical implications of this, but I'm kind of failing right now. But he has this idea of the absolute recoil, that where the very loss of something creates that lost dimension. And so like when I think that I've lost something, the only reason I miss it is because it's, hockey. The only reason I
This must be what I'm like talking all the time. Oh. I guess these. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that it's like the Kafka seminar like leaked over into Schelling somehow. Oh, wow. He completely went away.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Wow.
Hunter's back. Hunter still looks like he's in Kafka land, I think. Look at that. Look. I mean, he could be Gregor. So Hunter, do you want to finish up, or you?
Well, just what was the last thing I said? Because I was talking about just the absolute recoil as this lost dimension that produces itself. As soon as something is lost, it produces the lost dimension. It's where, like, there's a quote that said the only thing, the wound can only be healed by the spear that smote it. And this is present in Marx, when Marx says the power of social disintegration that is brought about by modernization, universal or modern universalism, beginning with Christianity, as a project, creates a wound. It's this power of social disintegration. This very wound opens up a space for liberation, and this mysterious X factor which opposes it. It's that which we feel deprived of is a specter engendered by the imposed privation, or the thing replacing it, the nothingness in place of what we're looking for, kind of like in a Bergson disorder sort of way. But that's all I'm going to say. I'm done getting cut off.
Yeah, so it seems like Hegel is he's using that idea of evil as a negation, but instead of using it as a kind of like static determination of basically differences and degrees of existence like you have in Leibniz and Descartes and whatnot. Instead, he's using that negation as the actual principle by which these things move forward into a kind of redemption of evil, I guess, which, well, maybe there's a contradiction there. So I was actually kind of confused about this in the reading, in the sense that it seems like it's saying that, evil as negation becomes, part of this dialectical movement for Hegel that is, coming towards a kind of reconciliation. So evil as negation, it works in his system. But I wonder if, what Hunter was saying about that human history is a theodicy, that basically in the working of that negation, it comes to some kind of a reconciliation or a justification of evil or whatnot by the result of that movement, towards the self-realization of freedom of the spirit or whatnot, or the Hegel stuff. So I'm not exactly sure how that works, but I see what they're saying in the sense that Hegel is still he's still using evil as negation, and he's using it in a unique way compared to the other people. He's still not exactly taking it on as something that's a positive reality, I guess. But it's interesting that it still seems to have those qualities as something that like can't be really totally determined, I guess. Kind of like what I was talking about earlier, that that evil is the principle that can't be rationally understood. It's something that jumps out of the system. But I wonder if Hegel's also using negation in a similar way. I know, like, someone like Deleuze would probably say no, but I don't know. I'm curious about exactly what's going on there.
In the hopes that I don't get ever cut out again, what I do know is that Hegel employs negation as a sort of, and I'm going to use some words that I learned from Deleuze, virtual negative space with in a form, in a concept, in a system of symbolic logic, at least. And that's the joke that Zizek always says, where he says a guy goes to a cafe and he asks for a coffee without cream, and they say, we don't have cream, but we have milk, so we can give you a coffee without milk, but we can't give you coffee without cream. And then everybody gives a polite laugh. And I guess the point is that there's this realm of negativity around things as to what things aren't. And I think that is pointing towards something. I think that it's pointing towards like this irrationality and rationality itself. This negative side to all positive things in a sort of, obscurantist way, I guess. But I'm not sure. But I think that that's what. But I don't think that that's necessarily. Yeah, it's still a negation. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I have a problem with, the whole, Leibniz Descartes thing, where they're saying, oh, these things are a privation, they're a negativity, they don't exist, there's not even a factor, really. But clearly seen from the angle of, I guess, life as you actually live it, a shadow is a thing, cold is a thing, maybe not things in the sense of extended substances, but they're phenomena that still makes a difference. And that's where I have a problem with the notion of negativity as something that isn't actually active in the world. It still, it makes a difference, I guess. I think Merleau-Ponty, that was kind of his critique of Bergson, and that he was saying that Bergson is too much of a positivist. He needs a kind of partial nothingness in order for that movement that he likes to occur. So maybe that's what he's getting onto. Yeah.
I think that I've seen cases or like instances where negativity for Hegel is a productive thing. A thing being destroyed kind of brings it into a notional form, and negativity can be really positive, or can produce positive content. And okay, I remember a joke that Zizek once told, or Orsini referenced once in a lecture that I think is a good example of this. And it's some terrible movie with Ewan McGregor, and he's on a date with a girl. He's going home, or he's going back to her place. They're standing outside, and she says, "Do you want to come upstairs and have some coffee?" And he says, "No, I don't want coffee. I don't like coffee." And she says, "That's okay. I don't have any coffee." And the idea is, he says no, then she negates that, and what is left is an erotic implication, rather than two people saying, "Okay, goodbye." there's positive content present in a negation being negated. There's something there left. There's this notion. And I think that that's where our speculative unity of opposites comes in, aka our spirit or our mind.
At the risk of shifting the discussion too much, I want to subject you guys to a picture that I use in my classes. Sorry. So I'm going to try to share this.
Which one of the three pictures is it? Is it one I've seen before?
Oh, is it?
I don't think this is one I've seen before, actually.
Yeah, this is a different one.
I thought you were going to show the one of Hegel with the headache or whatever.
Yeah, with the full head headache.
Yeah.
This is my picture of the sort of way things work with Mill, and with Kant. I also use it with Mill. But the idea is that for Kant, the willing is making a choice, and then, as I understand it, your choices can be motivated either by inclination or duty. And if choices are motivated by inclination, what this guy's calling them is evil. I don't know if Kant ever calls them that or not. Actually, maybe he does. But and so the way that this guy in this commentary is describing it is that if it's motivated by inclination, it's an evil choice. If it's motivated by duty, it's a good choice. But the strange thing here is it's kind of a similar problem for Augustine. When Augustine says the will can be either attracted to God or attracted to created things, and then if you ask, he explicitly says, if you ask, why does the will choose one or the other? Augustine literally says there is no reason. It's absolutely arbitrary. It just does it. And he has to say that because if he said something caused the will to turn away from God, then that would again say that there is metaphysical evil. There would be some evil existence that was the cause of the will turning away from God. But he wants the will to be completely free, so there can't be any cause for the will to turn away from God. It just has to do it absolutely freely with absolutely no cause at all. I mean, Augustine's very explicit about that. So, on this picture for Kant, it seems like there might be a similar problem in why do I choose to choose to do my rational duty as opposed to indulgent inclination? I mean, it seems like you could ask Kant the same question. I mean, maybe I've got the picture wrong, but at least in my understanding, maybe Kant would say the same thing. Maybe he would say, well, it really is free. You just choose. But that seems to be kind of irrational in that you can't give a reason or an account why. And so I'm not, I mean, this is really speculation on my part, but I'm wondering if maybe there's some part of why Schelling wants to reintroduce metaphysical evil is it might be able to give an account of why the will chooses, one direction rather than the other. Maybe since there's sort of a positive metaphysical principle of good and a positive metaphysical principle of evil, that could give you maybe a more intelligible explanation of why we make bad choices, perhaps.
So, sorry, go ahead,
yeah.
Sean.
Okay, sorry. All I was going to say is I think Kant has an answer to this, but I think it's an epistemic answer. So I think if we start talking about his distinction between the noumena and the phenomena, and the way that we think about our need to conceptually make things match with the categories that we have, within our mind in order to be able to make sense of them, I always interpreted Kant's answer to this particular problem to be essentially, look, the way that we categorize the world clearly boxes out this intellectual possibility, because everything has to exist within a causal order, but what we need for the free will to exist is for there to be like an a-causal thing that isn't arbitrary. And I think what Kant wants to say is, well, that exists, but it obviously it can't exist in a way that is consistent with our categories that we use in order to interpret the world. So it's sort of beyond the horizon of our phenomenal capacity to interpret something, right? Like I almost think of it as almost sort of like over the hill, because we have a sense that it's there. We have a sense that agents have this free will, and it gives them the capacity to behave, morally and immorally. And we have a sense of morality that is consistent with rationality, according to Kant. So it's almost as if like this sense of how it is that agents choose is sitting just out of sight, beyond a mechanism that is vital to our capacity to interpret the world, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, but that seems to be, I mean, that's completely seems right as far as how I understand Kant, but it leaves this question, if that's the case, you can't give an explanation why one would choose one thing rather than another. If the will is free, like you said, because the will is not bound by the causal determinants of phenomena, because it's somehow grounded in the noumenal ego. But what that means is he has then put out of question any answer as to why. Because like you said, we can't get access to that sort of some sort of trans-rational domain. We don't know anything. And so I'm wondering, maybe, I don't know if Schelling has what Schelling says about, transcendental things, but, maybe Schelling's maybe he's trying to solve that problem as well. It seems like a big part of the history of German idealism is trying to get rid of the noumena, because everybody hates the noumena. And maybe that's part of what Schelling's doing there too.
Yeah, I think, so what Kant, I guess, is, or at least, so I'm going to try to, I guess, kind of paraphrase what you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong necessarily, but so Kant is, what can't be figured out is why the will would determine either inclination or reason as, the whole categorical imperative thing. It has, very clear criteria in the department of reason of what it can choose to, do the moral thing. There's no way of determining which one it would actually choose. That aspect of the will is what is outside of our ability to understand according to the whole phenomenal set of laws and Newtonian mechanics and everything. So that's part of the noumenal. We know it's true in itself, or at least Kant says that it's true in itself, but we can't determine it based off of things that we can verify by science and empirical testing and all those things. So I think that's basically what Kant's argument is, and to kind of I guess somewhat defend Kant, I guess, or at least connect him with some other people. So it seems that idea that will itself, the actual act of the will as something free, it's something that can't be put into a kind of representational symbol system. And I see, we saw that in Bergson, we saw that in Whitehead too. This idea of the decision and the spontaneous act are not things that can basically be determined by past instances. That they come out of this kind of spontaneity of creation that's ongoing, instead of necessarily something like in mechanical Newtonian physics, where you can determine everything just based off of past causes and whatnot, and you can use mathematics to fully determine those things. But there's something different with living organisms, as Bergson and Kant say this. So in Kant's third critique, he says that organisms have a kind of different order that stretch basically into the noumenal, because they can't be grasped completely by those same kind of Newtonian mechanistic laws and whatnot. They have an order where it's something like there's an idea that they have this kind of like a circular structure of what we call today kind of like in complexity theory and whatnot, that they're like dissipative systems, that there's some sense of that they create their own order in like these feedback systems. And he says basically that that's something that is roughly outside of those mechanistic laws. And we know that there's some kind of continuity or unity between our minds and this noumenal principle because of that. But ultimately living organisms are outside of that strictly causal deterministic kind of order. So I think that's why he says also that if a tree and whatnot is outside that order, then obviously human choice is also going to be. And I know he has a whole nother series of arguments in the critique of practical reason as to why human freedom has to be in the noumenal and whatnot, but honestly I don't really even know those arguments, or I can't remember them. But I think it's interesting though still that we have there's a whole kind of tradition of thinkers that are going to say that you can't really put freedom or the will into a kind of rational system like this, like the way that a kind of like a libertarian argument for free will would try to put them into work them in with laws of science and whatnot, I think all these thinkers are going to say that that's a misguided kind of enterprise.
Oh God, I just forgot what I was going to say. Oh yeah, so so what I'm going to, I'm just wondering. I mean, what this is really doing is sparking my curiosity as to where Schelling's headed, because, you know, for one, I don't know whether Schelling has any notion of the transcendental. I'm kind of hoping not. And then if the cosmos is just these, you know, these sort of two principles. I mean, it reminds me a lot of Bergson, but, you know, you've got the ground and whatever, the ground and existence. And if the so-called evil is kind of, you know, the words I read earlier, he called it chaotic and anarchic. And so it's going to be interesting to see if Schelling connects freedom of the will to, you know, to his metaphysics in that way. And if freedom, you know, if making good and bad choices or good and evil choices is going to be somehow connected to those metaphysical principles, and if that notion of anarchism and chaos is going to enter into it. So that's, I don't know, that could be pretty interesting.
I agree with you, and I found one paragraph in the introduction that I think might speak to what you were asking as to what Schelling's project is. It's on page, okay, XXVII 28, and it's the third paragraph, and it starts, in our opinion, the philosophical investigations is one of Schelling's most daring attempts to make sense of the tensions in Kant by reinterpreting their instability as the very essence of a theodicy of life, as the living surface of a whole justified by its vital dynamism. Here, a central point for Schelling is precisely that a homology between God and man must not be possible. To the contrary, such a homology would be the highest expression of evil itself, a sort of cosmic suicide, because its achievement would mean not only the disappearance of God, but that of man as well. What we suggest here, then, is that the theodicy understood in the modern sense is ultimately demanding and also despairing of such a homology, whether openly or covertly, is indeed a most terrible form of evil, a leap into madness that seeks to close the universe at the cost of life itself. The search to become a god leaves human beings in the tatters of aging Oedipus, strangers to themselves in the world. This surely is the essence of evil as Schelling sees it. Hence the corrosive irony is that the modern theodicy of life is indistinguishable from an evil condemnation of life and ultimately of itself as untenable and unfortunate fiction. And I agree with you that I'm interested in seeing what the freedom that Schelling speaks of says to this matter. And I think it speaks on what you called about Schelling describing nature and how it interacts with evil as chaotic and anarchic. And I hope that made sense. And I'm sorry for being late.
So does anyone else think that that sounds like the internet?
This is exactly like you take a Deleuzian and you have them read Schelling and then they go, hey, this sounds like the internet. Like, I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying that's exactly what
I was just throwing that out there, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting thing. Like, I get a thing. This might be a bit of a tangent, but like taking that in mind and taking that particular passage in mind, I don't talk about it as much, but I'm a big Camus boy. And the thing that I've sort of been reading or like realizing as we've been sitting here and chatting about this is how much of the Rebel is essentially like an anti-theodicy. Like it's basically just like, no, actually evil isn't justified, and the attempt to justify it it basically destroys morality. So I think that this is, I'm very eager to see where this goes in terms of, I think this might be an interesting thing to contrast with the Rebel, which might mean that I have to reread it again as we kind of go along. I definitely think that the ideas that Schelling is going to bring up very much is going to reflect on the capacity of a certain set of philosophical traditions to really like justify their worldview and justify the relationship between reason and like basically the process of philosophy and how it's relevant to the way that modern society functions. Which is to say that it sounds like it's the internet.
Exactly, the internet. No, so I think really, so Heidegger, he wrote a commentary and I think did a lecture course on this essay, and you can see there's a continuity between this and his thinking about technology, and just the way that it talks about basically making the singular, the individual, universal. That sounds like the internet, especially kind of maybe not so much the internet, but that the internet is like the purest expression, I think, of this force where you have basically, you know, the desires of the individual turned into your own world for you. This, you know, algorithms and feedback loops that propel us along into our own kind of universalization of our own, you know, fetishes and perversions and all these things, where we're living inside of our own world and it's all customizable for us and we love it. And that's basically what I think of as the internet. And well, I mean, that's obviously that's not all that the internet's about, but I could definitely see how you could see this in like a modern way of this is talking about, you know, complex human activity and technology and whatnot. Not that I necessarily think that all technology is evil, but it's interesting to see the parallels between those. But to kind of go back to some of the earlier stuff, yeah, so I think what Schelling is going to do, so where Kant was saying, you know, yeah, this stuff has to do, this criteria of evil and whatnot and freedom, it all has to do with human activity and the basically the like metaphysical description of it. We have to bracket that out. That's just in the noumenal, you know, we can't know that. Instead, Schelling is basically going to he's going to put those things from the human and say instead they're actually in, you know, the divine nature of God or whatnot. And he's also going to, in the same move, he's also going to give them a kind of metaphysical basis. And he's going to say that the instability, just the inherent instability of the vital force of becoming, of reality itself, is what is responsible for those conditions in which you have kind of like this two-sided coin of freedom and evil, where each implies each other, and you can't have one without the other. That's kind of my best way of describing, essentially, I think what he's going to argue, I think, is what to find out.
I don't know if Schelling's going to directly address this. I wonder how that would fit with Leibniz's thing about this is the best of all possible worlds, which always strikes me as just obviously and ridiculously ridiculous statement. But wow, craziness. But you know, I'm wondering, because if you know, if Schelling's system or whatever it is, if this sort of chaotic principle is necessary in order for there to be life and movement in the universe, then I don't know, maybe you could say the same kind of thing. you know, because maybe he would say, for example, a world without evil would be a static, I guess something like maybe Plato's domain of the forms or something where nothing ever happens. But so I don't know if, I mean, saying it's the best of all possible worlds seems like not a good thing. I mean, a ridiculous thing to say, but maybe I'm wondering if he's going to say it's like, it's just the necessary state of affairs or something. You've just, if you're going to have a living world, you're going to have this, something like that.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I see it. And yeah, you know, so an optimist would say basically this is the worst of all possible worlds. And the greatest pessimist would say this is the best of all possible worlds. So I think Leibniz is yeah, he's horribly depressing. He's a horrible pessimist. This is the best of all possible worlds. Like, Jesus Christ, like, turn on the news. Like, what kind of world is this? That's not a theodicy. That's like a condemnation of the world. That's like Schopenhauer kind of stuff, you know? But no, I think that to a certain degree he is basically saying that there's this kind of natural like dynamic vitalism to reality that necessarily comes about with conflict and antagonisms and whatnot. Like, he has this notion of identity where so one thing I was reading this description of Heidegger's commentary on this essay, and they're talking about how his notion of identity with pantheism, you know, of where God is equivalent with the world, that the problem with that notion that people usually have is that they see identity as just the same equivalence, that they're the same thing, that God and the world are the exact same thing. But really he's saying that identity is necessarily a kind of relation between opposites, and there's a kind of natural like tension and differentiation and antagonism to identity itself. And I think that notion, and you know, I'm thinking this of course makes me think of kind of Nietzsche's basic metaphysics of, you know, like the will to power as these kind of clusters of antagonistic forces and, you know, vectors of force against each other that compose things. It strikes me as something kind of like that. And for there, I would say, sure, you're going to get stuff that people are going to say is evil or whatnot, but then again, does that really justify it? Because, so what Sean was just saying about Camus saying, you know, evil isn't justified, that strikes me as just intuitively correct, that like what evil is, that should be the definition of it. It's exactly what is not justified. So how can we, is the whole idea of a theodicy, like, it seems ridiculous that it's all about justifying evil, but like, what is evil if not what is unjustified? So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Yeah.
I obviously, given that I'm a weird Camus boy, I feel similarly. I'll see if I can reread The Rebel and maybe bring in some ideas from that, or at least reread parts of it, and see if they might bring interesting commentary. Since I don't normally do the whole parallel reading thing, that'll be my contribution, as I'll go and read something that I want to read anyways.
That would be cool. I've been wanting to read that for a few years now, but yeah, too busy now because of the evil of technology and modern society and the internet. Unjustifiable.
You know, one of the questions I have about metaphysical evil versus, it's going to be interesting again to see what he does with moral versus metaphysical evil. here a while back, I don't know, a couple years ago, I was sitting in my living room, and one of our cats was outside, and I heard this cat scream, and a coyote got it. And of course, by the time I got out there, it was too late. And then my wife took our dog out to, out in this wild area behind her house, and found the cat's head. So, but it's, it's hard to call that evil. Like a friend of mine who's a Zen priest, she said, well, the way she put it was, coyotes got no credit card. They can't go to Wendy's and order a hamburger. And so, I mean, why would you call that evil? It's just what nature does. And, it's like it's kind of, I call it evil because it violated my wish, my desire, violated the way I want the world to be. But why would I call that evil? But on the other hand, when someone chooses to murder someone, for example, or exterminate, millions of people, that seems to be a different kind of evil, and one that involves choice. And so I'm curious to see what Schelling does, by bringing in this metaphysical evil, how that relates to that sort of thing, like natural occurrences that really aren't evil, but that run like tornadoes, right? Or hurricanes or COVID-19. I mean, can you really call that evil? I mean, it's just viruses doing what viruses do. But, someone choosing to walk into a crowd and shoot a bunch of people, that seems to be a different kind of thing. So again, I'm curious, how is, Schelling going to address this metaphysical evil versus moral evil, given that he's bringing the metaphysical back into it again?
Yeah, I share those same sentiments, in that, intuitively, I don't necessarily see those things as evil. That's more kind of going back to that, bad versus evil distinction. Those are bad things. But yeah, so one thing I think that's an interesting point. And, this introduction, they're specifically focusing on theodicy and that whole question of evil and whatnot. So the short little thing that I read on Heidegger's commentary is, so Heidegger tries to somewhat, maybe ignore isn't the right word, but I'll just go with that. He tries to somewhat ignore the theological aspect of it, and he's interested in more the fact that there's some kind of a radical new ontology going on here. So basically, in order to do his theology, he has to do something different and special with ontology, and that's what Heidegger finds interesting about it. And also, I think that's what kind of goes along with this I guess, theme of a kind of, emphasis on process rather than a substance ontology, that I think by now you guys know that I'm into this. So that's what I'm really looking forward to, on top of all the how he does try to answer, these kind of theological or theodicy questions or whatnot.
Well, it's 7:00. Any last comments? Or so welcome to Ron and Jackson and Alex. We lost Hunter somewhere along the road.
Hockey.
You guys are always welcome to join whenever you can. So, this is a very informal group. So when you can connect, do so, and we won't do anything bad to you if you don't. So were you going to say something, Chase?
So I was thinking about, I watched this video last night, and it was this guy he's writing his dissertation on Schelling's Ages of the World, and he's comparing the different drafts of it. And I was thinking about possibly just like emailing him and asking if he'd be willing to just like join our group once and just like answer questions or talk with us or something. Is that something you guys would be interested in?
Yeah.
Cool.
Who's hiding behind Jackson? Oh, another guy. Yeah, that sounds fine with me. So also for those of you who came in a little later, we're recording these, and Chase is going to post them on a YouTube channel that he has. And what he usually does is I record them, I send the video to him, and he posts them, and then he usually sends out the link on the email list. So if if you ever want to catch up and go back and see something you missed, that'll be available to you. So, okay, so if there's nothing else, I guess I'll say bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. It was interesting, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Next time.